I'm not your typical clinical psychologist. Although I do all the things that an academic psychologist does, I teach, I do research, I mentor, I see clients, I do a lot of service. What makes my work particularly unique is I spend a lot of time thinking about journalism and journalists as a psychologist. In fact, a better part of my career has been spent trying to convince journalists and news executives why they should care about traumatic stress. Together with my colleagues at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, we've come a long way in influencing how stories about trauma are told, from beginning to end. And end is not when the experience ends. It could be generations later. We've also done a lot of work helping journalists take care of themselves. Many of them, we don't think of them that way, are first on the scene and spend a lot of their time bearing witness professionally to pain and suffering. Today, although that work has been tough, today my task with you is even harder. In just a few minutes, I'm going to try to convince you, each and every one of you, why you should not only care about this thing I'm calling trauma-related journalism, but why you need to demand it. My goal is to convince you. Let's see. Will I convince you? I'm going to try to convince you that, in fact, trauma-related journalism saves lives. And the second thing I'm going to try to convince you is that trauma-related journalism can not only prevent future violence, but it can restore justice and mitigate the harm. The reason I think that this is going to be such a challenge today is I'm going to be asking you to override a biological survival instinct. When we see something frightening, when we are scared, our immediate response is to fight, to get out of there, flight, or to freeze, play dead, like a deer in headlights. I think the same thing happens when we read or consume truly horrifying news. We deny it or we get mad and we don't believe it. We stay away from it, we don't want to hear it, we turn it off, we don't consume it. Or we become numb, something my colleagues have called compassion fatigue. I'm asking you to think about that and to overcome that as we talk about this issue. I'm also asking you to overcome another tendency, which is as human beings, we want to seek out pleasure and avoid pain. And I'm asking you to think about painful, suffering experiences that so many people experience. And let you think that this is an abstract issue, it's not. The sad news, I am the bearer of bad news, is that 60% of people in the United States will have experienced a car accident or any kind of accident, a disaster, violent crime, or abuse. 6 out of 10. What that means in practical terms is that you or a loved one need the kind of information that journalists are providing. And if you want to think about it selfishly too, it also means that just because you're at a certain place in a certain time, it's likely that you or a loved one is going to be covered by the news at one point in your lifetime. This is vital information. So, now that I've told you why it's important, I want to convince you that, in fact, journalists save lives. Let's start by thinking about disasters, tornadoes, wildfires, hurricanes. At the time of a disaster, journalists tell us where to go and how to keep safe. When you think about the acts of 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombings, not by design, but news was the emergency communication system. It told people how to get home. It told people who was safe and who wasn't. It saves lives. Another way that journalists save lives is the mere presence of a journalist, particularly a photojournalist, in a situation where violence can erupt, can actually prevent that violence from erupting. Potential perpetrators may not act if, in fact, they're being watched. It's the principle that we've been having in the US that we've been talking about whether police should have cameras. Do cameras prevent both police officers and community members from engaging in violence? It's the reason why we need journalists everywhere, being our eyes and ears. They really can prevent. So physical safety should be obvious. Journalists keep us safe. But what about psychological safety? I argue that the kind of news that I'm advocating keeps us psychologically safe. What do I mean by that? It reduces isolation. It makes us feel more powerful after a traumatic event has rendered us powerless. It keeps us connected, and one of the things we know is that social connection after traumatic event is one of the predictors of health and adaptation, both at the individual and the community level. I was in Haiti several weeks after the earthquake, and simple information about children's mental health, about rebuilding, about anything, what is an aftershock. All these pieces of information helped people every day, not just in terms of what they provided, but they gave people a sense of control. This image behind me depicts, it's one of my favorite images, it depicts a group of people who have just survived a paramilitary massacre, and they came together to talk about their experiences. Why I love this picture so much is the very talented journalist who took it also was wise enough not to put them in further danger by revealing their identity. But this is an example of the kind of psychological safety and the power that can be done in terms of journalism. This came home to me a few years ago when I wasn't actually doing any work in journalism. I also do a lot of work in disaster mental health. And I was volunteering at Camp Gruber, which was a temporary shelter here in Oklahoma for displaced Katrina survivors. And I was assigned one day in my disaster mental health hat to go check on the housing where the people with persistent and severe mental illness were housed. So I went in and greeted someone, explained who I was, and the person pulled me over to their bed. And they said, look what happened to me. And over their cot was a picture of them breaking news of being on top of their roof, almost ready to die with the water rising. And I'd meet the next person. Hi, I'm Elana Newman. I'm working with the Red Cross and the Medical Reserve Corps. They'd pull me over to their bed. Look at what happened to me. Look what I came from. And they were shivering and lying in the sun dehydrated. This kept happening again and again. Rescues, breaking news, the news we think, oh, isn't that exploitative? That news was very much for each and every one of the people I met that day. It was a touchstone. It was a way of saying, look at what I survived. Look at the chaos and look at my survival. And it really surprised me to hear that. So I think I've proven to you that it keeps people psychologically safe. And I think this happens with all kinds of survivors. Rape survivors hearing about other rape survivors. Very powerful. All right, so I've talked about safety. What about this issue of preventing violence or restoring justice? These images behind me were taken of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia early in the war. They were transmitted. Ron Haviv took these. They were transmitted, and we saw them in the Western world. They got out of Bosnia. They were front-page images. They didn't stop the war. It doesn't always work. But these very images, breaking news at the time, that we ignored, were just used in the last 3 years at the International Criminal War Tribunal to prosecute war crimes. Made a difference in restoring justice. I'm here on a college campus. The hard-hitting and compassionate work that was done by the Center for Public Integrity recently investigated how colleges and universities were investigating sexual assault. The work was so compelling that legislation came out that are keeping all of us safer in trying to protect you on college campuses. I can think of examples this occurring, looking at investigative reports, again, well done, survivor-centered, for child abuse in the church, how domestic violence is handled in your community. Are you ready for a disaster? Again and again, we see examples of how journalism can actually prevent future violence. So now that I've convinced you that journalism can save lives and prevent violence, I need your help. And it's not going to be easy. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is keep thinking about overriding your biological tendencies. When you see a news article, oh, again? Not again. That seems boring, that you're numbing to. It may be that that article's poorly done. Or is it that you're overwhelmed? When you get angry at what you see, are you angry at the situation? Or are you angry at the reporting? I'm asking you to really think about your response. And if you do that, it can help you make choices in your community as citizens. And it can also help you do these other things. When you see good reporting, compliment the people who did it. Share it, spread it on your news feed, use social media, tell other people about it, but also tell that journalist about it. Thank them for doing good reporting. It's just a quick note. Similarly, when you see bad reporting, and there are examples of that as well, criticize the reporting. Maybe not demonize or troll the reporter, but speak up. I'm also asking you to really think about the fact that if 60% of people in the US alone experience a trauma, what traumas are going on in your community? Investigate those and tell your community journalists what you need covered in your community. They can make a difference. And when you see reporting that's not being done enough, particularly the aftermath reporting, demand it. Start a social media campaign. Call a producer, call an editor. Demand what you want. Tell a news media owner what you want to see. That will make a difference. And finally, when you see journalists in danger, stand up for them, whether that be in your community when they're threatened. We're threatened. Stand up for their rights. Several years ago after Hurricane Katrina, I was there maybe 3 or 4 weeks after the storm, and I was having dinner in one of the few restaurants that were open with a local journalist from the Times-Picayune, John Pope. And as we were having dinner, people kept coming over the table and saying to John, "Thank you and the Times-Picayune. You sustained me in the storm." And I thought this was unusual the first time. It kept happening every 5 minutes. Somebody came up and said, "Thank you and your paper. You kept me alive, not just only during the storm, but after." I imagine a journalism in a society where almost every story about cruelty and chaos and disaster, horrible things, is met with that same kind of appreciation. I imagine a world where we thank journalists for telling us bad news, because we need to know this bad news. I also imagine a world where we say to journalists, "Thank you, you are doing us a public service as truth tellers, explaining to us what we need to know, and you, in fact, are making the world safer and restoring justice." Thank you.